basically I sat down to get this organized and my mind went blank. I forgot how to do a live stream. So there are things I should have checked that I completely forgot to check. Bugsy Malone says, love this show. Well, thank you. Neurocraft says, I posted a comment on your last video with a bunch of potential resources for your game, but YouTube deleted it. Yes, YouTube doesn't like references to other websites at all, even if it's not in link form. But when someone leaves a comment, even if YouTube ultimately removes it, I still see it because I get a notification. So actually, I saw the first part of your comment, and I think that's the first thing on the agenda. Well, no, it's not actually. The first thing on the agenda is Rumble, because I said that I wanted to upload my videos to Rumble just to have one more site to have my videos on. And I couldn't do it previously because I didn't have a mobile phone number. So I gave in last week and I got a mobile phone number. And so I was able to register with Rumble. However, there's something strange going on because I uploaded last week's episode to Rumble on the Monday, and at the current time that episode has 4 views. So there's something going on there. There's something not quite right there. Of course, if you upload a new video to a new website and you've never had a presence there before, your video is not going to get a lot of views, but 4 views, all of which, by the way, I suspect are mine, that seems rather low. So if you look in the description box, you'll see a link to my Rumble account. Can one of you please go to that link and check to see if that video is publicly available? Because if that video is publicly available, then I don't really understand how Rumble works. Do you just have to wait until the souls that manage Rumble happen to pick your video to feature? Because otherwise it seems like it's very hard to get views. Like, as much as I complain about BitChute because you can't upload videos properly on the site half of the time, at least on BitChute, even if you're brand new to the website, if you upload your first video, you're going to get some views there no matter what. But that doesn't seem to be the case on Rumble, assuming I'm not doing something horribly wrong. So yes, I'm going to give a bit of a driving update too. I found my driving instructor, and it's not the kind of individual I would expect, because when you think of a driving instructor, or when I think of a driving instructor, I think of an older person perhaps, but my driving instructor is really young. She's 26 years old. And the reason for that is that, as I said before, when most individuals learn how to drive, they basically already know how to drive. They basically know how cars work. I'm not like that because I've never had an interest in driving or cars. So I don't have a clue what I'm doing. If you put me in a car and told me to start it, I wouldn't even know where to begin. So because of that, I feel I'd be more comfortable learning to drive with somebody I know. And this girl happens to be the sister of a guy I know. And she's also friends with a few female friends that I have. So I don't know her personally, but I'm at least vaguely familiar with her. So she's just actually freshly passed her driving instructor test. So yeah, she's going to be my instructor, and that should be starting in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I'll finally be behind the wheels of a car, which is going to be interesting because, again, I don't know the first thing about driving, so we'll see how it goes. But obviously, I'll report everything back here. I hope there's going to be no further delays. The thing is that because I didn't have a passport, I had to provide the driving license people with all kinds of proof of identity, including a birth certificate. But I've only ever had what's called an abbreviated birth certificate. I've never had a proper birth certificate. And the person I handed the forms into, who then sends it off to the DVLA, I think they're called, he said he didn't know if they'd accept an abbreviated birth certificate. So we'll see how it goes, but again, things are all in motion. Now, Liam says that it is on Rumble. Okay, so I'm not doing anything wrong. It is just the website. Thanks for confirming that. So, as far as the game goes, last week I asked if there was any programs for me to create a simple game. A game where it would be a turn-based, text-based game, like a strategy game, but you're getting announcements each turn. You have to decide how to respond to events and so forth. So something very simple. and several individuals proposed different programs, including Neurocraft, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I had a look at some of those programs, and they seem designed for choose your own adventures primarily, and I think there is a way I can get one or two of them to do what I want them to do, but I ultimately decided just to code the game from scratch because I could foresee that at a certain point I'd want to develop the game in a certain way, and those programs would just not allow me to do that. So I decided to start coding the game from scratch, and I decided to use Python for that. Python is essentially, in terms of being a language, it's just like C, all the C languages essentially, but I think it's got some features that are more intuitive than the C languages are. So, I started coding this week. Coding is something that I've done before because I've been in web development a lot, and web development, if you're doing it properly, necessarily involves some coding, but coding a website or doing code on a website and coding a video game from scratch, well, they're two different things. So this has been a bit of a learning curve for me, a bit of a crash course, but I'm getting there. What I've created so far is a text-based adventure, very simple, where you as the player, you're an adventurer and you're given a choice to go east or west, and depending on what you type in, it's like a text adventure from the 80s. Whatever you type in, the game responds to, and even doing that is quite complicated in terms of coding. But the thing about me is, and I think this will be obvious to anyone who's watched me for any length of time, and this is another great reason to avoid the vaccine. That's a joke, YouTube, that's a joke. But I do already have a severe case of the internet autism. And for those of you who don't know, the meme internet autism is an obsessiveness, a single-mindedness. So for example, when individuals on 4chan track someone down based upon the way the sun is falling in the background of their photo and things like that, in meme language that's called internet autism because they're so single-minded and focused on their task. It's an obsessiveness essentially, and it can be used in a negative way and it can be used in a positive way, but I definitely have a case of that, whatever other terms you want to call it, because when I'm focused on a project, if I care about the project, then that's all that exists in my world, and I'll go at it obsessively. And coding, it really appeals to my nature. I could sit there for days just doing nothing but coding. And it was the same when I was writing my book. Nothing else existed while I was writing this book. This sounds like a marketing spin, but it's flatly true that I put so much effort, I put so much work into this book because I do have that thing about me where when I'm focused on a thing, that's all that exists, and I'll break myself getting it right. So even though this is a bit of a crash course for me in terms of learning, and I'm having to learn all kinds of new things, it's appropriate for my nature. That kind of thing really appeals to my nature, and I can fall into it very, very easily. But coding a game from scratch is very, very complicated. I mean, there's so much code you have to write, even just to do a basic text adventure, choose your own adventure. There's so much coding that has to be done for just that. The kind of program that I'm trying to make, to code it from scratch, is going to take an awful lot of work. So this is not something I'm going to talk about each and every week because it's going to take so much work that what I'll do is I'll just do a little bit here and there now and then one day, months or years down the line, I'll finally be on here and I'll say, hey, I've got my game to a working state. And again, this is not a game that I think I could reasonably sell. This is just something I feel like doing in my free time. Just one of those things I need to get off my chest. I think it's a double-edged sword living in the modern day, because on the one hand, technology has allowed individuals to do anything. You can be anyone and you can write a book and get it published, for example. You can be anyone and code a game and release it for the masses, essentially. Technology has enabled that. But the downside of that is that the market is now flooded. The downside of that is that everything has become horrifically disposable. And this is true in every area. I mean, if you look back to the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, in terms of music, there were definite names. You know, you've got your Bowies, you've got your Floyds, you've got Whitesnake. I think I'm revealing a lot about myself because of the names I'm giving out here. But names like that, but music these days, you know, the artists and the bands that arise, they're very disposable. They're there one day and gone the next. It's really hard to imagine that 20 years down the line, the bands and the singers that are emerging now are going to be remembered in the same way that someone, you know, remembers David Bowie or something like that. And that's just the way things have gone due to technology. And so every market, because everything is so easily accessible for everyone, every market is just flooded. And it's part of that double-edged sword where, yes, it's great that we can all do these things, but because we can all do these things, whenever you create something, whether it be a book, a game, a piece of music or anything, you really are spitting into an ocean. Even if you have the backing of major institutions, you're still spitting into an ocean to a huge degree. So that's something that I think about a lot in terms of creating things. You know, the other night, I had to get up I couldn't get to sleep one night this week, but I had to get up at 6 o'clock the next morning. And it was one of those nights where I don't really have any problems in my life, but if one were to look at my life, they could describe it as a problem, is that some nights I simply cannot sleep, and there's no apparent reason for it. It's just that I've always been a night owl, and so the challenge throughout my life has been having to balance the fact that I simply don't sleep some nights with living a regular life, and it's always proven to be something of a challenge. You know, I've often gone into work, for example, without having slept. That just became something that was a part of my life. And what I learned to do a long time ago is to not fight it, because in times past I'd be lying there at 2 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't get to sleep, and I would just get very frustrated, you know, lying there just getting very, very frustrated at not being able to sleep. I've long since learned to not fight it, to just accept things, and my spirituality has a lot to do with that, of course. So if I'm lying there one night and I can't get to sleep, I just get up and do whatever I want to do. So I couldn't get to sleep. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I got up, I put a massive steak pie in the oven, and then I while that was cooking, I sat down and started coding my video game. And in the end, I did get about 2 hours sleep before I had to get up and do what I had to do. And that's just the way I've learned to live my life. And of course, some days you're very tired, but that's just how it is. There's a strange phenomenon, and when I first try to articulate it, a lot of you are going to be thinking, what on earth are you talking about? But if I elaborate upon it a little more, I think you'll understand. It's this strange thing in my life, or this strange feeling where you start thinking to yourself as if you're nearly dead. You start thinking to yourself as if you're at the end of your life. So take driving, for example. There are times where I would think to myself, even though I've never had an interest in driving previously, but now I've got a reason to, there are times where I would think to myself, well, you know, I just never got around to learning to drive. As if I'm an 87-year-old as opposed to a 37-year-old. I think a good example of that kind of thinking that many of you will relate to is when it comes to maybe you drink to excess, or maybe you smoke, or maybe you do drugs of some kind, and you say to yourself, well, you know, I've been doing this for so long now, there's really no point in giving up, but you're actually a really young person. You know, you're saying that as if you're in your 70s and you've smoked all of your life, so you might as well keep going, whereas in actual fact, you're in your 20s. It's that strange thing, and that's why this episode is titled the way it is, Not Dead Yet, because I have to remind myself, oddly enough, that and I think my spirituality plays a lot into this, the fact that I have a wide perspective on things. I'm always thinking of things in terms of eternity. I have to make a conscious effort to remind myself that in terms of my mortal life, I'm not dead yet. You know, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after. We don't know how long God is going to let us live. But assuming that I don't die from unnatural causes, I've still got about 4 decades left. And so whenever I catch myself thinking, well, I wanted to do this, but, you know, I just never got around to it, I have to remind myself, well, wait, you're only 37 years old. The world is still your oyster. You've still got every opportunity to do anything you want to do. And it's just a strange phenomenon that I think is worthy of consideration, why that comes about. But it's not something that I've given a great amount of thought to. It's just something I wanted to comment upon. I haven't said much about the lockdown or the vaccines of late. Here in this country, it's just been announced earlier today that apparently all of the lockdown measures, the masks, the social distancing, which I never did in the first place, apparently they're all coming to an end on the 19th of this month. I had to go downtown earlier this week, and I won't say the place, but I had to go into a certain place, and it's the kind of place where you would think that they would definitely enforce mask mandates. It's the kind of place where you would think that if I walked in without a mask, they would say something to me about it. And so I was preparing for a fight, essentially. I was preparing to go into that place to be challenged about not wearing a mask and to just put up a fight on the subject. But actually, that's not what happened. I went into this place and no one there was wearing a mask. Not one of the people that was working there was even wearing a mask. And so around here, at least, it seems that people really have just given up on the whole thing anyway, which is good as far as I'm concerned. But there is one thing about the vaccine that I haven't talked about yet. And I think it's an important thing, especially given the kind of individuals that tend to be really zealous about getting the vaccine, is that whatever else you think about the vaccine, whatever your opinion is of whether or not to get the vaccine, what's absolutely true and what no one can disagree about is that we have no idea what the long-term effects of the vaccine are going to be. Now, given that the individuals who are really zealous for this vaccine are typically quite hysterical in the first place, the kind of individuals that I've talked about before, where when this started, they might have had all kinds of libertarian principles, but the moment they faced the slightest threat, they threw all of them out of the window because they were afraid, essentially. Given that those are typically the kind of individuals who are zealous about the vaccines, you've got to think that it won't be psychologically healthy for them to have injected themselves or to having had themselves injected with a substance that they don't know the long-term effects of, because that would surely play on your mind. You've been injected with something that you don't know the long-term effects of, so for years to come now, whenever something is slightly wrong with you, you're going to immediately think, well, what if this is a long-term effect of the vaccine? What if this is really going to screw me over? It just occurred to me this week that that's going to be playing on a lot of people's minds, and a lot of individuals in this country are quite frankly mentally ill. I think that this lockdown, the hysteria over the virus, I think that it didn't send anyone insane. What it did was that it inflamed a lot of pre-existing mental illness, and that mental illness has manifested in all kinds of ways at different times. But I think this lockdown and this hysteria has really served to inflame it in a lot of people. And I think the fact that a lot of people have taken this vaccine for, it seems, increasingly little to no reason, I think that's really going to play on their minds. So even though things are opening up on the 19th, theoretically, in this country, I wouldn't count on that being the end of this whole scenario. I think, obviously, in terms of the economy and in terms of the psychological damage done to all kinds of individuals, we haven't even begun to see the tip of the iceberg, quite frankly. And this raises another question. It's a question of compassion, essentially, because I naturally have very strong opinions. I believe that one should not be vaccinating children. On GB News this week, this Scottish guy called Neil Oliver, I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of him personally, but he does have long hair, and us long-haired guys do have to stick together. But he delivered a wonderful monologue on GB News pointing out, he outright said, in fact, that a society that unnecessarily vaccinates the young in order to save the old is a society not worth saving. Now, it's not often that I hear someone else articulate my thoughts in a way that I haven't yet, but that was certainly a case of that. I thought that was beautifully articulated, and I fully agree with that. So I very strongly believe that the young should not be vaccinated unnecessarily, especially when, again, we don't know what the long-term effects are, and especially for the benefit of older individuals, because as Neil pointed out, that is contrary to nature. However, of course, spiritually speaking, there is the issue of compassion as well. And you've got to find a balance, essentially. I mean, you're always guided by your conscience anyway, but a balance has to be struck, because on the one hand, yes, we acknowledge that certain individuals have been scared out of their mind due to the media and the government, and they've been made hysterical, essentially. And it's because of that fear, it's because of that hysteria, that they are advocating things that they otherwise would not. So on the one hand, we can acknowledge and be sympathetic to that degree, because we understand why they're suddenly advocating for all of these draconian authoritarian measures. But on the other hand, they are advocating for all of these draconian authoritarian measures, and therefore on a societal level they pose a clear and present danger. So this is a kind of situation that I've been confronted with a lot in my life, because I care about root causes. But of course, what's more important than root causes is the reality that we're faced with. So there's been many individuals that I've been in conflict with in real life, really violent individuals, and I knew, for example, that they had had a terrible upbringing. I knew, for example, that they had been abused growing up. But at the end of the day, those considerations and those facts were secondary to the reality that this individual, whether because of those things or not, this individual now poses a physical threat to those about him, and you really have to deal with that individual on those terms rather than retroactively making excuses for them because of what they went through in the past. Because the fact is that different individuals go through different troubles, and they all don't turn out the same way. These individuals that are advocating for these draconian measures, yes, they have been subject to government and media propaganda that has made them hysterical, but all of us have been subject to that same propaganda as well, and we're not advocating for those measures. So no matter what a soul has been through, it always has to come down to personal responsibility at the end of the day, the choices that we make. And of course, spiritually speaking, that is really a binary choice. You're either living according to your egoic desires, including impulses like fear, or you're listening to God as he speaks through your conscience and intuition. That's the binary choice. That's why the New Testament, as I explain in chapter 12 of this book, that's why the New Testament presents life as being a choice of being either a servant of God through Jesus, or a slave to the flesh and therefore a servant of Satan. That's why the New Testament presents that binary choice, because you're either deferring to your egoic impulses or you're deferring to your conscience and your intuition, either to the devil or to God. And so we can be understanding and we can be empathetic while still saying that no, whatever your reasons, however understandable they are, to understand is not to justify. And if you're advocating for draconian authoritarian things, you have to be opposed, at least to that degree. So another thing I want to talk about, of course, is the Canadian church burnings that have been going on, and this has become very serious now, because it's not one or two isolated incidents. It seems to be ongoing, and it's a good example of how certain elements on the left, they don't know anything and they don't care to know anything. What they're really waiting for is an excuse. Because for those of you who don't know, this all began when a grave site was uncovered, a grave containing children, and they were native children, it seems. But the thing is that these elements on the left have kind of made certain assumptions about that grave site, namely that the individuals in the graves were the victims of the Catholic Church, and that they were tortured and murdered and put in those graves. I've heard those graves be described as a mass grave. First of all, you know that I have no problem speaking about the crimes of religious institutions, including the Catholic Church. If I wanted to, I could talk for 2 hours about the Catholic persecution of the ancient Gnostics and then the later Cathars and so on. I'm perfectly well aware of the crimes of different religious institutions. However, I don't harp on about those subjects because it's not productive to do so, and I certainly don't blame modern day Catholics for those crimes because that makes no sense whatsoever. Even if modern day Catholics were reincarnations of souls who actually committed those crimes centuries ago, it would still make no sense. It wouldn't be right to blame them for those things. So we can acknowledge such crimes without having those crimes colour our current reality. That's just not healthy, and that's just not productive at all. But in this case, there has been no crime established. And it speaks to the ignorance of certain elements on the left that they make certain assumptions, because in their head, Christianity bad, Catholicism bad, therefore if there's a graveyard here, it must be because of foul play at the hands of these wicked Catholics. But all over the Americas there are graves of that kind, both of indigenous peoples and also of the white settlers and their descendants, because disease was rife in the early days and living was hard, and there was often no opportunity to bury people in what you might consider a composed fashion. So it's perfectly possible that the individuals in these graves died of natural causes. There's no reason to suppose otherwise. There's no evidence that anything was the contrary. But the thing is that I'm speaking logically here. I'm speaking rationally here. But I'm not deluded enough. I'm not naive enough to think that those elements on the left that have been burning churches, I'm not deluded enough to believe that they actually care about the facts. They of course don't care about the facts. As I said, what they've been waiting for is an excuse. They've always had a problem with Christianity in particular. They'll point out its crimes and its failings, but they won't point out those same crimes and those same failings when they have been committed by other religions, because ultimately their problem is not with those crimes or those failings. Their problem is with Christianity itself. It's a really kind of juvenile, rebellious spirit they've got to the religion that they grew up around and that they're most familiar with. And so I'm not even going to pretend for 2 seconds that those who are burning churches down even think they're doing the right thing or even think that they're trying to get revenge. They really don't care. They're just using this discovery as an excuse, because the thing is, these elements on the left, they make up, this is true of leftists generally, and the further to the left you go, the more you'll find this, is that, I've said this before, I think, their view of reality is informed not by what they witness in reality, it's informed by the way they feel about things. So this is a perfect example of this. So you have this grave site discovered, and it's connected in some way to the Catholic Church. Therefore, because these individuals have that prejudice against the Catholic Church in the first place, a narrative is immediately written in their mind. There's these indigenous graves here, it's related to the Catholic Church, therefore Catholics are evil, so those indigenous individuals must have been tortured and murdered by these Catholics, and that becomes reality to them. That's how they feel about it, therefore that is reality. And this is why you can never reason with these individuals, because when you attempt to reason with these individuals, you're making the naive assumption that they are arguing in good faith. You're making the naive assumption that they, like you, are looking at the facts as they exist and are trying to come to rational conclusions when they're not. Their priority is always the narratives that are conjured in their mind based upon how they feel. That's how they see reality. There's a wonderful saying, and I've said it before, and I've never looked up who actually said it originally, but I guess it doesn't matter. But the saying goes, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And that is so true of those on the left, in that they're constantly projecting their own prejudices and their own desires and the way they want things to be, the way they think things should be, out onto the world. And that's why you can never reason with them, because they're not trying to objectively assess reality. They are quite simply seeing things based upon their feelings. But I'll say this, to those Christian individuals out there, and this is what certain elements in the left don't and can't understand. So this is kind of my issue, because I'm not on the left or the right, and I have big problems with both sides. I do not like these trad LARPers on the right at all. But of course, at the current time, a lot of them are very upset about the churches being burned, and that is inflaming their passions. But I'll say this to them, which is that there's a sense, yes, of course, it's not good. It's a destructive thing that these churches have been burned down and these communities no longer have a central focal point. But there is something of a bright side to this, because the worst thing that can happen to any religion is not persecution. I was saying this to Lauren Southern this week, actually. The worst thing, because she, being a Canadian, was talking about it. Yeah, she's one of those Canadians that, goes about the world and just... well, never mind. The worst thing that can happen to any religion is not persecution. On the contrary, the worst thing that can happen to any religion is when that religion becomes normal, when it becomes perceived as mundane, even by its own adherents. And that is what has happened. That is what did happen to Christianity here in the West. It became bland. The idea of going to church on a Sunday, it became boring. And that's especially true over here in this country. That is the worst thing that can happen to any religion, because then there is nothing but apathy towards that religion. Actually, when religions are persecuted, they tend to thrive in terms of the zeal of their adherents. And this, historically speaking, has been especially true of Christianity. I suspect, this is just my historical theory, of course, in the early days, in the early centuries, Christianity was persecuted by the Roman Empire. And then Constantine, despite what a lot of people think, he wasn't the one that made Christianity the state religion of Rome, but he did make it legal to be a Christian. It was the Emperor Theodosius, later on in the 4th century, that made Christianity the state religion of Rome, and also defined it as Trinitarian, even though at that point most bishops were towards the Arian side of things. Regardless, I suspect, I have this little theory, it's a pet theory, I'm not going to, die on a hill for it, but I have a little theory that if Christianity had not been persecuted so harshly by the Roman Empire in the early centuries, then it could not have become the world dominating force that it eventually did. If the Roman Empire had been apathetic towards the Christian cult as it was back then, I suspect it would have been more likely to fizzle out at that point, but that's not what happened. Because while all religions thrive under persecution to some degree, it's especially true of Christianity, because the teachings of Christ, or the teachings of Yeshua, they're all about being persecuted. They're all about how, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. That is right in line with Christianity. So what's kind of unique about Christianity is that when Christians are persecuted, those Christians tend to see it, if they know their scriptures, they tend to see it as a vindication of their belief system. And that's why Christianity tends to come back stronger after periods of persecution. So for those Christians who identify as Christians and who care about collectives like that, which I don't, by the way, I'd just say that ultimately all you've lost is a few buildings so far. And in the long term, this is actually going to serve Christianity in Canada, because again, nothing inspires zeal more, especially in Christians, than when they are seen to be persecuted in some way. So if that's the kind of thing you care about, then I guess you can take heart in that. Bugsy Malone says, Brynor says, Anglo-Celtic Canadian here, he is 100% right. Well, thank you. Bugsy Malone says, I really just got the vaccine because my wife was hopeful about it, allowing us to travel again. I'm not fearful of it, because only the good die young. I'm going to live forever. Well, R.I.P. Bugsy Malone. F in chat for Bugsy. He won't be with us for much longer. I'm just joking, YouTube. That's the annoying thing about YouTube these days. I'm saying things that are obvious jokes, but because of the way YouTube is, I have to clarify that, because otherwise I'll be in trouble. Tate quotes Mark Twain saying, never argue with an idiot, they will drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. Leo says, how would you differentiate between intuition as you describe it and the feelings that motivate these leftists? This is something that only comes with practice. What I will say is that intuition has no emotion attached to it. I mean, that's the most obvious difference. You know, if you, I mean, you know when you're angry, for example, you know when you're upset, and I guess in the early days, it could. Nicholas Holmes, oh damn, completely forgot about the stream this week. Blocked. I'm just kidding. Yeah, in the early days, it could be difficult to distinguish between your intuition and your emotions. I can see how that could be a problem, but it's just a case of persisting in meditation, especially, and with time you learn to distinguish. But as I say in the book, the voice of God that comes through your conscience and intuition, it's not pushy. It doesn't insist on things, and it's not trying to tempt you or lure you into doing anything. It's just there as a knowing. Emotions are not experienced as that kind of knowing. Emotions are something different entirely. So it might take some time to learn to distinguish between the two, but they are very, very different things. And this is why I found it necessary to introduce the ethereal body, because we've got a physical body, we've got a mind, then we've got our ethereal form, and it's in our ethereal form, which you might call our ghostly or phantom or astral form, it's in our ethereal form that emotions are felt. But it's from the spirit, God, that our conscience and intuition comes. That's why I made such distinctions in this book. See, the thing is about this book, as I said earlier, because of my meme autism, I worked very hard on it, and because I'd spoken to so many people across so many years, I knew exactly the kind of questions they would have. I knew exactly the kind of objections they would make to whatever I wrote. Again, the meme autism really helped with this, so I made sure to make it as full as possible. And the book falls short of 100,000 words. That actually surprised me. I suspected that by the end it was going to be around 200,000 words. And while I certainly could have written 200,000 words, I kind of felt that I'd said everything that I needed to say already. So that was one pleasant surprise. Okay, so another thing I want to talk about is GB News. So this is a new news channel here in the United Kingdom. And yeah, it's just going pretty well. Again, it's pretty normie if you're used to the internet, if you've been spoiled by the internet as I have. That is pretty normie. You're not going to hear anything groundbreaking there, but as an alternative to the BBC, to Sky News, it's going pretty well. But another perfect example of why I don't go with collectives, whether it be the left or the right, is that individuals are now complaining about GB News, those individuals who were initially in support of it, simply because GB News is not saying exactly what they want to say. So, for example, if GB News is discussing the vaccine, they'll have two guests on. One guest will be for the vaccine, and another guest will be against it. Not against it in the way that certain elements on the internet are, but as much as a normie program can allow for. But then, if you look in the Twitter comments in response to that video, you'll see individuals on the right who previously supported GB News saying, why are you pushing this vaccine stuff, on the basis that they happen to have a guest that is pro-vaccine? See, this is the hypocrisy that you see on both the left and the right, is that previously these individuals on the right, they were ostensibly complaining about BBC News and Sky News because according to them it was one-sided. They weren't presenting a balanced perspective. They were complaining about the bias that the BBC and Sky News had. So now when GB News comes along and they have two guests on different sides of the argument, suddenly the complaint is that they're allowing this alternate guest, this pro-vaccine guest, any voice at all. So this is the hypocrisy you see. Their problem from the beginning was not that BBC News and Sky News and CNN and CBS, their problem was not that they were slanted. Their true problem, it turns out, was that they were slanted in a way they don't like. Now that GB News is there, they're complaining because they want GB News to be slanted in the direction they want. They want one side of the argument, their side of the argument, so they're not really interested in having a fair and balanced news source. They're really only interested in hearing someone affirm their worldview. It's been kind of amusing to see that. But in an indication of how normie GB News really are, there was something last week, and I meant to talk about it last week, but I just didn't have time. So what happened was that someone was trolling, well, they used the term trolling. Someone was writing harassing material, let's just say, to a presenter on GB News, and this individual ended up being arrested. And what got me when GB News were covering this is that they described what this individual did to this presenter as trolling. But let's be clear about something. The reason that individual was arrested for saying what they said to that presenter was that they made a death threat. They threatened to dox that presenter. They implied that they would be sending individuals to their home. That's why the police arrested that individual. That is not trolling. But that's a problem with this kind of normie television program, is that they don't make a distinction between trolling and actual threats. And again, I think that comes from a generational divide, because Andrew Neil, the guy who created GB News, he's an older guy now. He didn't grow up with the internet. He's not a child of the internet. I mean, I'm not a child of the internet either, essentially, because I grew up prior to the internet. When I was a kid, I was out playing with wooden swords and things like that. It was only in 2005 that I got access to the internet. So I didn't grow up with the internet in the same way that many others did, but I still know the internet. And I don't like this conflation of trolling with making actual threats, because I don't think this is conscious on the part of GB News, but what that basically does, because you know how easily individuals online, especially older people, call something trolling. The moment someone disagrees with them, they call it trolling. So if trolling has been conflated with crimes, with making actual threats, then that just opens the door for all kinds of censorship then. Because if you're described as trolling someone, suddenly you could be seen as breaking the law, or at least be someone worthy of banning from social media. Now again, I'm sure that GB News are not doing that intentionally, but I really don't like this conflation of trolling with making actual threats, actual criminal activity, because they're not the same thing at all. Trolling, I think is really okay. I think it's an art form in a sense. It can be done very, very cleverly. And again, there's distinctions even within trolling, because there's trolling and there's griefing. Griefing is a more aggressive form of trolling, but trolling is funny. Trolling is witty when it's done well. There was a great example of this. I don't know. I don't know how many of you saw this, but the Tour de France was on, this bicycle race, and one of the bystanders accidentally knocked one of the cyclists down, and that in turn knocked the rest of the cyclists down, which must have been the most embarrassing thing to endure. I've lined up some footage for those of you who haven't seen it, so I have to move over to this side of the screen. So if you pay attention to this side of the screen here,
a bit of time until we get this peloton back together. Well, the stupidity of a fan at the side of the road. Look at this. Tony Martin comes through, is not even facing the peloton, which you should never, ever do.
So all those cyclists fell down because that one woman there decided to hold out a sign saying "Hello, Grandma," "Hello, Grandpa," something like that, and she fled the scene immediately. But she has since been arrested for doing that. Regardless, the trolling in response to that, and look, Neurocraft started already, the cyclists couldn't take the bants, but the trolling in response to that incident was hilarious, because cyclists are one of those groups that tend to take themselves very seriously. So there was loads of great trolling going on. There was people responding to that video saying, bruh, a car, that wouldn't have happened if you were in a car. The cyclist should have moved out of the way of the sign, or these are the elite cyclists of the world, and they get knocked over by a cardboard board. Because obviously, if you look at the video, she's holding out the cardboard sign, but the cyclist doesn't just hit into the cardboard sign; he hits into her arm. That's obvious. It's like he basically clotheslined himself, and that's obvious from the video. But these individuals who were trolling were like pretending they didn't see that. They're just like, I can't believe the best cyclist in the world got taken out by by cardboard. That just shows you, you know, cyclists, they're always creating problems and then blaming someone else. The trolling was just brilliant, and it was really, really clever. See, that is trolling. You know, sending death threats is not trolling. That's sending death threats. Now, harassment, persistent harassment is not trolling. That's persistent harassment. And we already have laws that cover making death threats. We already have laws that cover persistent harassment and stalking. So we certainly don't need to expand those laws to include trolling, because trolling has nothing to do with those things which are criminal activities. And I don't like the line being drawn. Another aspect of trolling, I guess, on the internet are what are known as lol cows. Now, what's a lol cow? A lol cow in internet speak, a lol cow, well, you would think that a lol cow, see, I've thought about this a lot, because, you know, I'm one who peruses Kiwi farms now and then and things like that. You would think that a lol cow is just someone who is a little bit out there, who's a little bit odd, who's a little bit not normal. But that's not quite the whole picture, because if that was true, then a whole lot of people would be technically lol cows. You know, technically I'd be a lol cow because I'm kind of out there in the things that I say and the things that I believe. But I would say there's two crucial elements to a lol cow. Without these elements, you cannot be a lol cow. The first is a lack of self-awareness. The second is, and it's really an extension of that first point, is that you're incapable of poking fun at yourself. Those things have to be in place for an individual to be a lol cow. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that without those things, someone isn't trollable. You can only troll someone if they take themselves or the subject at hand seriously. You can only troll someone if they are incapable of poking fun at themselves and if they react aggressively to anyone who criticizes them or makes fun of them. That's the only kind of individuals you can troll. And so a lol cow has to be someone who doesn't have any self-awareness and who is incapable of poking fun at themselves. And that's why an individual like me, even though, yes, to a lot of individuals I'm very strange, I couldn't be a lol cow because I already know how I come across to other individuals, and I'm perfectly prepared to poke fun at myself. So without those things, you know, you can't really be a lol cow. But, you know, I enjoy the internet. I enjoy internet culture. I enjoy the way it's developed and things like that. And it's kind of funny to see these individuals from older generations who they're trying to grasp the internet. You know, they're trying to understand the internet in the way that it works. They don't seem to understand irony. They don't seem to understand that some individuals, and I don't think this is a healthy way to live, by the way, but they don't seem to understand that some individuals who spend a lot of time on the internet, practically their whole existence is ironic. I mean, I would view that as a defense mechanism, but these older people just can't grasp that. They can't grasp communities like Kiwi Farms, 4chan, things like that. They just can't. And yeah, I think this conflation of trolling with making actual threats is not only mistaken, I think it's quite dangerous in terms of censorship, the kind of censorship it might help to usher in. So we're coming up to the top of the first hour now, and so it's time for entertainment talk. I don't have many updates to give on Indiana Jones 5 this month, but the update I do have to give is it's not good news. Certain outlets reported that Harrison Ford's injury, you know, when he was trying to throw a punch and he injured himself, Harrison Ford's injury is worse than it seemed. And so whereas previously it was believed that production would have to shut down for 3 weeks, there are certain outlets reporting that production will now have to shut down for 3 months. Now, it's not clear what's going on because there are papers that consistently report that, but the director himself said that they're continuing to shoot. But if they are continuing to shoot, it's definitely without Harrison Ford because he's walking around in a sling now. Now, a delay of 3 months is bad news. That's bad news for any film production. And if that is true, if Harrison Ford cannot get back on his feet for 3 months, then I would fully expect the release of this film to be delayed even further. And this will be the 4th time the release of the film has been delayed. And this is kind of a good example of how progressive ideals so often smack into the brick wall of reality, because the director James Mangold, he's been quite touchy. He's been quite sensitive in terms of the way he's responded to criticism. Someone wrote an article that was called something like 5 Reasons to Be Worried About Indiana Jones 5. And one of the reasons that author wrote was that Harrison Ford was 78 years old. Now that is a perfectly reasonable point. It's perfectly reasonable to say, well look, Indiana Jones is an action film and the star is now 78. That's a reason to be concerned. But what the director James Mangold did was that he called it ageism, as if this author was just being prejudiced against someone because of their age. And then it was only like 2 or 3 days later that Harrison Ford injured himself, which is kind of ironic. But it's a good example of how, progressive ideals so often clash with reality. Okay, so you want to pretend there's no differences between men and women. You want to pretend that there's no differences between any cultures. You want to pretend that a 30-year-old is the same as a 78-year-old. Well, you're free to do that, and you're free to call those who disagree sexists, racists, and agists. You're free to do that, but at some point, you're going to hit reality. And the reality is that a 78-year-old is far more prone to injury than a 30-odd-year-old. And that should be obvious. Now, you can call that observation ageism if you want, but it's still reality. So, yeah, I hope things go well in this production. I do have a bit of good news from it, and we're in kind of spoiler slightly. If you really don't want to know the title of the film, then plug your ears for the next 10 seconds, but there was a photo of an alleged script released, and I have reason to believe it's genuine, and the title of this 5th Indiana Jones film apparently is Indiana Jones and the Order of Elysium, which I think is a fantastic title. I hope that, I know it's a genuine title, but whether it's going to be the finished title of the film, it could just be a working title, but I really hope that Tate says Indiana Jones with the shoulder reconstruction. I really hope that is the finished title of the film, because that is a cool title for an Indiana Jones film. I said I would try to avoid spoilers, and I'm going to here, but I couldn't help myself. I also heard some of the plot details, which I won't share here because I don't want to spoil the film. Plus, on YouTube in the modern day, it's quite risky doing that. There are film studios going around hammering down on those who share spoilers. Like someone did a video relating the plot details of the 4th Matrix film, and Warner Brothers shut them down immediately. So I'm not going to give any potential spoilers, but let's just say if this is the actual plot of the film, I'm very happy with it. And I will say that it's got nothing to do, as I said, it's got nothing to do with the Fountain of Youth. You know what happens sometimes in these live streams is that I'll start talking about something, and I may talk about it quite extensively, and I'll start saying something to the end of making a point, but I get distracted from making the actual point. So last week I explained that one thing I want to do is to go down to Loch Ness. Actually, there's a lot to update you on that. If you just give me a second, because I've got this idea for my next book, and I've elaborated upon the idea now. But I was talking last week about going down to Loch Ness and wandering around. Now, again, as I said, I don't necessarily believe in the Loch Ness monster. Certainly not as a plesiosaur. Now, when I was speaking about this last week, I consistently called it a plesiosaur for whatever reason. It's not. It's a plesiosaur. Those aquatic dinosaurs with fins, essentially. That's what the Loch Ness monster is held to be. I don't believe the Loch Ness monster is that. But could the legend have some basis? Quite possibly, yes. And another thing I didn't say about Loch Ness that's very important, because it's hard to get a sense of scale from this map. But Loch Ness is 26 miles long. So when I say that I intend to go down and explore the mountains surrounding it, based on accounts of the creature being out of the loch, That's a hell of a lot of ground. 26 miles that way, 26 miles that way. So that's a hell of a lot of ground to cover. But last week I explained that, you know, the first account of the Loch Ness Monster, it comes from the 6th century, from St. Columba. And I pointed out last week that what's interesting about that original account is that it didn't take place in Loch Ness. It took place in the River Ness, which is here, that runs from Inverness and obviously from the sea, which is significant, but I never got around to explaining why that is significant. So what I'm going to do this week is read you a translation of the original account, and then I'll explain my ultimate point. So this account was written over a century after the incident itself took place. This account of St. Columba's encounter with the monster was written by another monk called St. Adomnan. So this is the original account, a translation of the original account. Okay, so it says, concerning a certain water beast driven away by the power of the blessed man's prayer, the blessed man being St. Columba, because he was held to do all kinds of miracles. Also at another time, when the blessed man was for a number of days in the province of the Picts, because again, St. Columba was known as the apostle of the Picts. He was in a huge part responsible for the conversion of the Picts of this land to Christianity. He had to cross the River Ness. When Lai reached its bank, he saw a poor fellow being buried by other inhabitants, and the buriers said that while swimming not long before, he had been seized and most savagely bitten by a water beast. Some men, going to his rescue in a wooden boat, though too late, had put out hooks and caught hold of his wretched corpse. When the blessed man heard this, he ordered, notwithstanding, that one of his companions should swim out and bring back to him, by sailing, a boat that stood on the opposite bank. Hearing this order of the holy and memorable man, Lugne Mokmen obeyed without delay, and putting off his clothes, excepting his tunic, plunged into the water. But the monster, whose appetite had earlier been not so much sated as whetted for prey, lurked in the depth of the river. Feeling the water above disturbed by Lugne's swimming, it suddenly swam up to the surface, and with gaping mouth and with great roaring, rushed towards the man swimming in the middle of the stream. While all that were there, barbarians and even the brothers, were struck down with extreme terror, the blessed man, who was watching, raised his holy hand and drew the saving sign of the cross in the empty air, and then, invoking the name of God, he commanded the savage beast and said, "You will go no further. Do not touch the man. Turn back speedily." Then, hearing this command of the saint, the beast, as if pulled back with ropes, fled terrified in swift retreat. Although it had before approached so close to Lugne as he swam that there was no more than the length of one short pole between the man and beast, then, seeing that the beast had withdrawn, and that their fellow soldier Lugne had returned to them unharmed and safe in the boat, the brothers with great amazement glorified God in the blessed man, and also the pagan barbarians who were there at the time, impelled by the magnitude of this miracle that they themselves had seen, magnified the God of the Christians. So I want to read another excerpt from the same book on St. Columba, because this is interesting. On the appointed day, as he intended, the saint came to the long lake of the River Ness, followed by a large crowd. Then the magicians began to exult, because they saw a great mist brought up, and a stormy adverse wind. So our Columba, seeing that the elements were being roused to fury against him, called upon Christ the Lord. He entered the boat, and while the sailors hesitated, he himself, more steadfast, ordered the sail to be raised against the wind. When this was done, and with the whole crowd looking on, the ship moved with extraordinary speed, sailing against the contrary wind. Now, just for the record, this account is taken from the website of the Loch Ness Project. The Loch Ness Project are a series of skeptics who are seeking to explain the sightings of the Loch Ness Monster and the legend as a whole. So this is not a website that belongs to believers who believe that there's a plesiosaur in Loch Ness. It's important to note that. But what's interesting about the second account here is that it seems that St. Columba was involved with some conflict with sorcerers at Loch Ness. And in that account, the sorcerers, to prevent St. Columba crossing the loch, they whipped up a storm essentially. But St. Columba went in the boat anyway. It brings to mind the gospel accounts of Yeshua walking on water through the storm to his terrified disciples in the boat. So the point, which I didn't reach when I explained that story last week, is that, again, the original account of Loch Ness Monster of St. Columba took place in the 6th century. It took place not in Loch Ness, but in the River Ness. And that's important because the River Ness is nowhere near as deep as Loch Ness. And if we're to assume that the sightings that take place in Loch Ness are of the same beast that St. Columba encountered, then we can say for certain that it wasn't a plesiosaur, because a plesiosaur could not exist in the river. It could not be in the river because, as far as we understand plesiosaurs, they are aquatic and they cannot come out to land. They breathe oxygen, but they can't come out on land. They are restricted to the sea. And so it's amazing that after all these years, there is still certain elements of this legend that I don't think a lot of individuals have thought about before, incredibly. And this is why I'm thinking, yeah, I could write a book about this, because there's a lot to be said here. And here's why I think people have been thrown off. Because if you just Google, for example, St. Columba's account of the Loch Ness Monster, you will find explanations of the story, or tellings of the story, that are not quotations from that original account that I just read you, but are kind of paraphrasings of it. And what's really fascinating is that in all of these paraphrasings of this story, what happens is that, yes, the incident takes place in the River Ness, but St. Columba banishes the creature specifically to Loch Ness. Now, as you now know, that is not in the original account. That is a detail that at some point in history has been added. And I suspect that detail was added to kind of reconcile the fact that this original account took place in the River Ness, and yet all the sightings take place in Loch Ness. So I think that individuals are just using their own imagination to say, okay, well, I guess if individuals are seeing the monster in the loch, then St. Columba must have banished the monster from the river to the loch. But that's not in the original account. The original account says nothing like that, which is really, really interesting. So my feeling is, and these are terrifying endeavors, by the way, let me be clear. I mean, even if you don't, let's say you don't believe in the Loch Ness Monster at all, if you're wandering about in the pitch darkness around some lake or in the mountains, it's quite terrifying, no matter who you are, no matter what your disposition is. So this is not going to be an easy thing to do next year, but I'm certainly going to do it. The key for me is that, first of all, okay, I'll walk around the perimeter of the loch in the darkness, yes, absolutely. But I'll also wander around the surrounding mountains. The reason for that, as I said last week, is that, look, everyone's eyes are on the loch all the time, but they're always on the loch during the daytime. What about at night time? You see, even those individuals who look for the Loch Ness Monster, you know, those true believers who look for the Loch Ness Monster, they always do it in really normal conditions. Because they're just normal people, you know, going out to look for a monster. And so they go out in the daytime in their boat and what have you, and, you know, we didn't see anything, and then go away. I think a more extreme approach is warranted here. That's why I'm doing everything at night, alone at night. So I'm wandering around the loch, and I'm wandering in these mountains silently. And it's as if I am part of the environment. No one else is going to be with me, because I think if there is something to be seen, which certainly isn't a plesiosaur, but if there is anything to be seen, if there is anything to be found, then that would be the way to do it. So I've got a certain I've got a certain instinct about how to go about this. And again, it's not that I'm expecting to find anything. It's that what if? And I feel that this is something I need to do for myself, something I need to get off my chest, because I think I was meant to do it, and that's just the way that it is. Now, someone in the comments last week mentioned Aleister Crowley, because Aleister Crowley had a house near Loch Ness, and this individual mentioned that it was odd that Aleister Crowley never mentioned the Loch Ness Monster, given who he was. You know, I thought the same thing myself, but I first heard many, many years ago, decades ago, that Aleister Crowley had a house by Loch Ness. My first thought was the Loch Ness Monster, because, you know, when you think of Loch Ness, you think of the Loch Ness Monster. If you're talking about an occultist, you would think there would be some connection there. So my first thought when I heard that decades ago was that, well, he must have bought his house near Loch Ness because of the Legends of the Monster. You know, the Legends of the Monster, you've got St. Columba's original account, and then the accounts after that, they begin in the 1700s. But that shouldn't be any surprise because that was when records, as we would understand them, began to be kept. So we don't know what sightings occurred before that, but we have sightings from the 1700s onwards. So the legend of the Loch Ness Monster did exist in Aleister Crowley's time, but having become more familiar with Aleister Crowley through his work, my suspicion is, and I'm pretty confident about this, my suspicion is that he didn't mention the Loch Ness Monster quite simply because he considered it beneath him. I think Aleister Crowley would have considered local myths like that quite beneath him. Now, Aleister Crowley is seen as a devilish individual. He's one of the most misunderstood individuals. He was deliberately provocative. He was raised among a Christian group called the Brethren, a very strict fundamentalist upbringing, and to an extent he rebelled against that. So at every opportunity, he did rebellious things. He did dramatic things. He called himself the great beast of the Book of Revelation. Really, really silly stuff. But he was a provocateur. That's who he was, and because of that, he is misunderstood even to the modern day. And he did certain things in his books that he intentionally did to upset individuals. So in one of his books, I think it was maybe the Book of Lies. I mean, even just the name of that book, the Book of Lies, he talks about sacrificing children, which in actual fact was a covert reference to masturbation. But even now, if you look here on YouTube, if you find some Christians talking about Aleister Crowley, you'll see them seriously assert that he sacrificed children when he didn't. He was just being a provocateur. And he was apparently a very effective provocateur, because he's still provoking people, a century in his grave. So I guess it's working out. But he is very misunderstood. Like, you'll often hear individuals quote him saying, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And that sounds really bad. It sounds like a really selfish philosophy in and of itself. But that's not the full thing. The full thing is, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law under love. What Aleister Crowley was actually saying there was rather similar to what I and other individuals who are focused on contemplation and mysticism were saying, because Aleister Crowley believed that one should be guided by one's conscience, or intuition as it were. Now, he certainly didn't use the same terminology that the individuals like myself would, but that's what he was essentially saying. So he's vastly misunderstood, thanks to his own efforts largely. And I became familiar with Aleister Crowley and his Thelema magic system through the tarot, because I used to have an obsession with the tarot. I probably know no occult tool more intimately than the tarot. The tarot associated with reading the future, but there's really much more to it than that. The tarot is a deck of cards, consists usually of 78 cards, 56 minor arcana, and 22 major arcana. The minor arcana are just like your regular playing cards. You've got the regular cards, and you've got the court cards, who in the tarot are figures of various kinds. And the regular cards are what you might describe as different states of being. And the court cards in the tarot deck, they represent different kinds of individual. And so if they show up in divination, in a reading of some sort, they'll usually represent other human beings who you have or will encounter. But the major arcana are very interesting because, again, they're 22 cards, and what they describe is a soul's journey here in the material realm and the different processes they go through. That's what makes the tarot so fascinating. Now, I discuss the tarot in this book in the final chapter very briefly, and I also mention Aleister Crowley because Aleister Crowley, being the kind of arrogant guy he was, being the presumptuous guy he was, and there's no doubt, as I say in the book, that he, if anyone had sufficient occult knowledge to have the balls to do this, it would be Aleister Crowley. But what he did is that in his version of the tarot, in his Thoth deck, he altered the major arcana. He altered the order and the structure of the major arcana. So in the major arcana of most decks, for example, you have the strength card. In Aleister Crowley's deck, that became lust. In most decks, you have judgment. In Aleister Crowley's deck, that became adjustment. And so there are all of these changes to the deck. And Aleister Crowley's reasoning for that was that he believed that he lived on the precipice of a new age. And because he lived on the precipice of a new age, the old tarot cards that referred to the old age, they were no longer relevant, and therefore a new major arcana was required. And that's the problem I have with Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck, is that it's designed based on a logic and on a viewpoint that I just don't agree with. I don't agree with Aleister Crowley's Thelema system and its worldview. I don't agree that at that point they were entering a new age. I just don't agree with any of that, and therefore I can't stomach the changes he made to the major arcana, which is a great shame because they are the most beautiful tarot cards. They were painted by Lady Frida Harris, allegedly while she was on LSD. And if you look them up, they are the most visually striking and colourful tarot cards you will ever come across. Amazingly beautiful cards, but I'm not a fan of his changes to the major arcana. But as I say in the book, because the major arcana of the tarot are telling the story of a soul's journey here in the material realm, and it is here in the material realm, it's little to do with anything beyond it. The tarot are a great tool to study by themselves. Again, when most individuals think of the tarot, they think of divination, they think of telling the future by reading the cards, which can be done, but it's, for me, as I say in the book, it's the lowest form. It's the lowest way you can utilize the tarot. As I say in the book, if you're someone with great insight, you're not really interested in knowing the future anyway, to be quite frank. You don't need to know the future. It's not a concern of yours. No, the greatest strength of the tarot is that it's an ingenious system that explains what we as souls go through here in the material realm. And if you start to understand it on that basis, then its true power really unlocks for you. So I since someone mentioned Aleister Crowley, give me an excuse and I'll use it. I took that excuse to talk about both Crowley and the tarot cards. But again, I think he didn't mention the Loch Ness Monster purely because he thought it was silly. I suspect he would have thought that such a subject would be completely beneath him. You know, the idea that there was some plesiosaur in the loch. But one thing I'm sure of is that he bought that house beside Loch Ness because of the legend. Not because he believed in it. I'm sure he thought it was quite silly, but because of the fact that others believed in it. And because others believed in it, the place had a certain power, had a certain mystic aura. Tate says the Aeon of Horus. Yes, it's very interesting that you should know that. In my bedroom, I've got Aleister Crowley's The Book of Thoth, which is the book he wrote to accompany his tarot cards. And I will say to this day, it is the most baffling, confusing book you can ever read if you don't know anything about the occult, or if you don't know anything about Aleister Crowley's magic system. Like, unless you've studied the Book of Lies, which is no light read in itself, then you have no hope of understanding the Book of Thoth. If you can find the Book of Thoth online by Aleister Crowley and you can somehow read it, then I invite you to do so. See how complicated that book is. Because Aleister Crowley, he was a highly intelligent guy to the point of genius, but he either didn't see or he wasn't concerned with the fact that few others could understand him. And so his books are damn near impenetrable unless you happen to have an abiding interest in similar subjects. And that's why if you look up Aleister Crowley's tarot cards on Amazon, say, you'll find a whole load of books that have been written to help you understand them. Even though Aleister Crowley himself wrote a book to accompany it, others have written books because they know perfectly well that, look, most souls are not going to have a clue what Aleister Crowley was saying here. So let's put it simply for them. Some really great books. In fact, I've got a book there. It's not about, or is it about? One of them might be. I've got books all over the place. You should see this place. Tate says Loch Ness possible interdimensional portal. That's something else I want to explore about the Loch Ness Monster, because there is the possibility, and we're going way out here. We're in X-Files, I want to believe territory here, but there's always the possibility, and I've raised this before, and I'm not the first to raise it, but it's not raised enough. There's always the possibility that the Loch Ness Monster is a ghost. there's always the possibility that it's what I would call an ethereal echo, as I explain in the book. You can have souls who, once they've departed their physical form, they linger around the material realm, and they are sentient. They are souls who have chosen to linger around the material realm to watch over someone or whatever it might be. But there's another form of what most people would call ghost, but I like to be more specific, and I call them ethereal echoes. They are imprints in time of souls that once roamed a certain place. And so, for example, if you see a ghost and it's going through the same patterns of behavior that it did centuries ago, that's not a sentient being trapped in some kind of limbo. That's what I would call an ethereal echo. It's an imprint on time. It's possible that the Loch Ness Monster is such a creature. It's the ethereal echo of a beast that once lived there, which would make tracking it down even more difficult. Again, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just being open-minded and raising all possibilities. So as far as this book goes, obviously I can write a lot about the Loch Ness Monster, but I decided this week what exactly I'm going to do next year as far as my adventures are concerned. So what I decided was that this next book will be based around 7 mysteries specifically of the Highlands of Scotland, and I wanted a diverse array of mysteries, and I've chosen them. So I'll show you the structure of the book, and this is all theoretical just now. As I said last week, a great problem with this kind of book is that it's possible that at the end of the day, when all is said and done, despite everything I've seen, I might have very little to say. But here are the 7 places I chose. Okay, so the first chapter would be the Loch Ness Monster, and each chapter, first of all, I will explain the history of what I'm looking into, the theories that have come about in the years afterwards, my own thoughts on it, and then my account of my own experiences there. So let's say I spend a week wandering around in the darkness in Loch Ness, around the loch itself and in the surrounding mountains. This account this section here, for some reason, as you saw in this book, I like to divide my chapters up into chapters and sections. I really like that because it's nice bite-sized reading. So this second one is interesting. The abandoned village of Loch Tay. Loch Tay is quite. We're getting into the lowlands here, not quite, but nearly. Loch Tay. There's this village there, and I think it was in the 1700s it was created, but it's abandoned. So what you've got there now are these ruined croft houses essentially, and it's all overgrown. It's kind of in a forest, and there's said to be a ghostly mystic that haunts the place. So spend a few nights there and see what happens. Glencoe, not as far away as Loch Tay, but Glencoe, of course, there was the massacre of Glencoe. That's why the glen is said to be haunted. That's another place. Knock Castle. Now there's 2 Knock Castles. This Knock Castle is the one on the Isle of Skye, which is said to be haunted by a certain entity. Spend a few nights in the ruins there. The fairy pools of Skye. I've got to go there in the winter because it's such a popular tourist attraction that in summer it's just ridiculously busy. So I'll camp around here a few nights at some point in winter. Sandwood Bay. This bay is only 70 miles to the west of me, so it's not far away at all. This one, I'm not sure. I might change this one because this one's a bit. We're really going out on a limb here. I think to the reader it might seem desperate because Sandwood Bay, there was once a sailor who claimed to see a mermaid on the end of a rock, and legend has it that there's a certain structure on the bay, and if you spend the night in that structure, then the ghost of a sailor who was drowned at sea will knock on the window. That location for some reason became famous for shipwrecks, and so it's said to be haunted. So I don't know about that one. I put it in there for now, but we'll see. If anyone's got any other ideas, then let me know. Of course, the ultimate, something I mentioned in this book, is the big grey man of Ben Macdui, who's an ethereal entity who haunts Ben Macdui and who is claimed to terrify individuals so much that they want to flee, possibly to their death. and you'll hear him wandering around, but you'll never see him except in shadows and things like that. A very terrifying entity. That one is different from the other ones in that I can't spend more than one night alone on top of Ben McDooey because I will definitely die. I can only do that one in the summer because in the winter I would freeze to death for sure. And even in summer, what I want to do is quite dangerous. See, all of these are, anytime you're out there in the wilderness, it's dangerous to an extent. You know, wandering about Loch Ness, wandering in the mountains surrounding Loch Ness in the dark is dangerous. But nothing is as dangerous as this final one. I mean, this is flat out silly to some degree. But it's the perfect way to end the book. It's the ultimate way to end the book. And so that's my plans for the book. And there are certain reasons I chose the locations that I did. For example, there are certain haunted castles that are more obvious than something like Knock Castle on Skye. But the key is accessibility, because a lot of supposedly haunted castles, they are well maintained and you can go on a guided tour of them. See, I can't use that kind of castle because that would involve me having to break in after dark, because there's no way they're going to give me permission to just access the castle and stay overnight. And therefore, if I want to have a haunted castle in this book, then it has to be an abandoned castle that is easily accessible. Knock Castle is perfect because it's abandoned, it's crumbling, and it's in the middle of nowhere. So I can easily access it and I'm not likely to be disturbed at all. So those kind of considerations were necessary in devising these things. But those are my plans for next year. So yeah, should be a lot of fun. What's interesting is Scotland's treasure laws. And this is something I didn't know before. But this applies to the whole of the United Kingdom as well. Let's say you're out somewhere and you uncover a cache of treasure, some Pictish tomb or something. If you discover anything of any historical significance, whether it's a clay pot or an entire Viking burial mound, whatever it might be, you are obliged by law to report it to the I can't remember what the institution is called, but it's to do with finding treasure essentially. You're obliged by law to do that. Otherwise, you could face fines or imprisonment. Now, you know my policy regarding money when it comes to like these live streams, for example, and spirituality. I don't like taking money for these live streams, and that's why I don't, because I'm speaking about spirituality. And so my conscience says no, to open a PayPal account or to ask money of you guys, that's not right. So that's the way I've always done things. But don't be fooled, because I'm not opposed to making money. It just depends the way it's done. For example, I wrote this book, so I've made a product that people can get. So when money is exchanged there, individuals are getting a product for it. That's fine. I have no problem with that. And the same is true when it comes to finding treasure. I'll be honest with you, I'm not happy with the fact that if I was to stumble upon some treasure, I have to hand it over, and if a museum decides to stock it, I may get something of a reward. I don't like that. If I find a treasure, it's mine. I believe in the law of finders keepers. So, here's what I do. Like, let's say theoretically, I uncover a cache of treasure somewhere. Here's what I'll do. I'll take photos of it, really great photos of it, showing how amazing this discovery is. I won't take anything though, and I'll leave the treasure where it is, and I'll re-hide it. When I get home, I'll email this treasury place where I'm supposed to report all finds to, and I'll say, hey, look at these photos. Do you like these photos? And they say, oh, that's an amazing find. Where's the location? And I'll say, well, I'm not going to tell you the location until I receive a significant amount of money, because if you don't give me a significant amount of money, then this treasure trove, which I haven't taken anything off, I'm not in possession of any of these items, I just know the location. If you do not guarantee me a significant reward for this find, then this find will die with me, basically, and no one's ever going to know where it is. That's the terms. As far as I know, that you could do that. I mean, I couldn't face legal liability for that. I haven't taken anything. I'm not in possession of anything that belongs to the crown. I just know where it is. So that's what I do. if it came to like a sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, like let's say I stumbled upon the Loch Ness Monster and it's walking in front of me, and I got like the most amazing, indisputable footage of it, I'd go about things in a rather similar way. I'd say, okay, look, here's a short clip of the footage I got of this creature, okay? I've got like 5 minutes worth of footage on this camera right here, but if you want to see the rest of this footage, then I want £5 million to be transferred to my bank account. That's the way I'd go about it, and in that circumstance, they'd pay it. So, don't misunderstand me. When it comes to spirituality, I have very specific principles when it comes to not taking money for speaking about spirituality, because it's spirituality. But I'm not some anti-capitalist. I'm not someone who doesn't believe in making money. No, I believe that individuals should have a right to make money. And yeah, if I found something out there, you bet I'm gonna try and guarantee that I benefit from it in that way, because it's a completely different subject entirely. And frankly, I believe that my endeavours deserve to be rewarded. If I go out there and I'm wandering the hills, or if I go out there on my own effort, on my own dime, and I make a discovery, I don't think it's right at all that I'm legally obliged to hand over to the Crown. I don't think that's right. So yeah, we'll see about that. That's all I'm saying. We'll see about that if it ever happens. So I think this would be a good opportunity to talk about these ancient mysteries in light of spirituality itself, because there's an interesting question I think that might arise, which is that I say in the book that I quote Yeshua saying in the Gospel of Thomas that at the end of the day, every secret will be revealed. In heaven, every secret will be revealed. So in heaven, we'll know the answer to everything in an instant. And an experience of gnosis. So I guess the question would be, what is the point? What is the point to doing any of this? What is the point to exploring worldly mysteries at all? If at the end of the day, when we die, we learn everything anyway, assuming that we have been liberated and that we're not going to end up in some hellish ethereal realm, what is the point? Well, first of all, the answer is going to depend on who you are. But for me, it's not even about my own conscious decisions to do these things. This is just what I'm driven to do. It's what, to use other language, it's what God is driving me to do, so I'm going to do it. It's really as simple as that for me. But if I think about it intellectually, well, first of all, your discoveries in heaven do not benefit anyone in the world. So, if you go out in mortal form and if you make some amazing discovery and you uncover some mystery of the past while you're still in mortal form, everyone around you can benefit from it. Mankind as a whole can benefit from your discovery. Whereas if you die and in a moment of gnosis, you know all mysteries, well, that's good for you and it'll be great. But that doesn't help anyone here on the earth. So that's the first thing, is that earthly discoveries while you're still incarnate can actually benefit humanity. So they're worth doing for that alone. The other thing is that there was another point. It's escaped my mind, but I'm thirsty anyway. Oh yes, the other point is that when you're in the ethereal realms, when you're in heaven, I can guarantee you this without a shadow of a doubt, with 100% certainty, you're going to have far more interesting things to concern yourself with than any earthly mystery. No matter how amazing or enthralling any earthly mystery may be, it's going to pale in comparison to what you're able to experience in the heavenly ethereal realms. And so when you're there, you're not even going to care about it. If we're to be concerned about these things at all, it's here and now while we're still in the flesh, because when we're not in the flesh, we've got better things to do. And I can guarantee that just based upon my own direct experiences of the spiritual, because if you have a direct experience of the spiritual, if you get that glimpse of heaven, as it were, you know the overwhelming majesty of it. You know the overwhelming grandeur of it. And you know that anything in this world, no matter how enthralling it may seem, no matter how amazing it may seem, it's as nothing in comparison to heaven. So those are my 3 points. First of all, it's not a matter of me deciding my own destiny anyway. I do what God leads me to do, and this is what God is leading me to do, and it's as simple as that. Second of all, these points keep slipping from my mind. Second of all, earthly discoveries, if made in the flesh, they can benefit the rest of mankind. And thirdly, when you're in heaven, you've got better things to do. The thing is about me personally, as it were, is that spirituality, as I've said before, it's not a part of life. It's not something you do. It's not a hobby. It is life itself. And so once you've found yourself in the spiritual sense, you still have to exist here in the material realm and do what you've got to do. And so while to a lot of individuals this interest in ancient mysteries may seem like a strange pivot from spirituality, it's anything but that. It's a natural progression in a sense. First of all, I've always had an interest in the great mysteries of history, supernatural phenomena and things like that. As I explain in the first chapter of the book, it was actually my interest in those mysteries that led me to spirituality, because I came to see, as many others do, that the spiritual is the great mystery from which all other mysteries come. So in my fascination with all these other mysteries, I came to the spiritual and I realized this is what I've got to focus on. This is what my life has got to be about, and that's, the rest, as they say, is history. So now that I've got this book out and I've said what I needed to say on that subject, it makes sense, even in an intellectual way, for me to return to those lower mysteries, as it were, because I think that's my place in this world. I think it's my purpose in this world to explore these mysteries. And again, I have no expectations of these things. I am very skeptical about these things, but I just know that I need to do this. Whatever comes of it, this is what I need to be doing at the current time, and it's really as simple as that, and I don't question it beyond that. Tate says, if you're ever in danger during your travel, simply do as St. Columba did and wave a symbol of the cross in the empty air. And that's something else that's worth bearing in mind, going back to St. Columba, is that if we were to take his account seriously, now, of course, no creature that we know of could live for 1,500 years, but, if we assume that these creatures breed, assuming they exist at all, then according to St. Columba's account, they are dangerous, they are lethal, they will try and kill you. So that is something to be worth considering. Can you imagine wandering about in the darkness and coming across some creature that is previously unknown? And again, we're not thinking about a plesiosaur. Or even if it was like this big, it would still be a terrifying thing to encounter in the darkness if you've never seen it before. But yeah, there is always the chance that it's aggressive, that it's hostile. But that's just the way it is. Tate says you must return the footage to Scottish Tourism Alliance. Is that true? Is that a fact? Let me just Google these individuals right now. See, I don't. I know for a fact things are different in the United States. Because in the United States there is, in fact, in certain states, I know for a fact there is a law called the Finders Keepers Law, where if you find something, you're allowed to keep it. And of course, Scotland being Scotland, that's not the case. You're obliged to hand everything over. So you on your own dime, on your own efforts, you go out and you make this discovery, and oh sorry, it belongs to the Crown. You've got to hand it over. And we may or may not give you some reward for finding this. I don't think that's fair at all. And yeah, I don't like the fact that if so I'm obliged to hand over footage now. So not only can I not keep any valuables that I find, I now have to hand over footage. I'm legally obliged to hand over footage. That's Scotland for you. But yeah, again, we'll see. We'll see about that. Tate says the ancients have told us the truth of this reality, but we are not ready to listen. I'm so glad you said that, because I almost completely forgot to mention something, which is a theological. I guess you could title this section, what I'm about to say, "Where do you even begin?" This week, for the first time in a very long time, I got involved in a theological discussion, and it was this atheist who'd posted something, and the atheist themselves was being quite reasonable, but the question they were asking was, why didn't Yeshua's disciples abandon him after his end time prophecies failed? And so naturally, if you read my book, you'll know the way I respond. I responded by saying, but Yeshua's end time prophecies did not fail. Yeshua was correct in saying that the kingdom of heaven would arrive and that he would return within the lifetime of those he was speaking to. The problem is not with Yeshua's prophecies. The problem is with the literalistic way that individuals have understood Yeshua's prophecies. Voice gone. So, okay, voice is really gone. Give me a moment. So, I explained, as I did to some small extent in the book, that, look, you look at the language of Yeshua, and it sounds really dramatic. It sounds really grandiose. But this is Hebraic idiom that you can find throughout the Old Testament. So let's look at the idea that Yeshua is supposed to return on a cloud. Throughout Christian history, the majority of souls have taken that absolutely literally. But if you look in the book of the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, he describes Yahweh as coming on a cloud to Egypt. Now, does that mean that Isaiah thought that God literally came down to Egypt on a cloud? Well, we know for a fact he did not think that, because he goes on to describe the fate that befell the Egyptians, and it has nothing to do with Yahweh being physically present among them. When the scriptures describe God or Yeshua or anyone as coming on a cloud, it indicates that this entity is arriving in a place with the authority of heaven, and that place is about to incur judgment, essentially. So we know that when Isaiah said that Yahweh came on a cloud to Egypt, he wasn't speaking about Yahweh literally coming down from heaven. Now, the writers of the New Testament were Jews who knew what we call the Old Testament inside out. Why would they use the same symbolic language of Yeshua? Why would they say that Yeshua is going to come on a cloud using the exact same symbolic language that Isaiah used, if they were using it in a completely different way to indicate that Yeshua is literally going to come down from heavens on a cloud? They wouldn't. They were using the same symbolic language as is found in the Old Testament, and that language was symbolic. It wasn't literal. It meant that Yeshua would return in some form and that judgment would fall, specifically on the people of Jerusalem in the case of Yeshua. It doesn't mean that a 6-foot Jewish man is going to come down from the clouds. And so that was my point. That was my original point, is that the problem is not Yeshua and his prophecies. The problem is the literalistic way in which these prophecies are interpreted by individuals who aren't familiar with the way that the Hebrews spoke, the kind of apocalyptic language that they frequently use to describe events that to us are relatively mundane. That's the real problem. And so I got a response from several materialists, just really predictable stuff. The first few of them, rather than try to dispute anything that I'd said specifically, they did the usual thing that they do. They used these complicated philosophical terms to describe my apparent errors, rather than specifying in plain language what those errors were. And internet atheists will do that a lot because they think that using these Latin terms makes them sound smart. and they hope that if they use them, you'll just be so impressed and so browbeaten by their genius that you won't offer any resistance. Wow, this individual is using this really obscure Latin term. He must be smart. He must know what he's talking about. But of course that wasn't the case. So I responded to them saying, no, look, never mind these stupid Latin terms that you like to evoke because you think it makes you sound clever. Tell me specifically what part of what I said is wrong. Factually speaking, historically speaking, in terms of scripture, what part of what I said was factually wrong? And of course I got no response at all, and this was like a week ago now. And then someone else came in, another materialist, and as if I'd said nothing, as if I hadn't laid out my case, she just said sarcastically, yeah, it's not God's fault that he wrote a book that we can't understand. And that's why this section is titled, Where Do You Even Begin? And this section will be particularly relevant for you if you've read my book and therefore know the way I understand scripture and the way I elaborate upon it and things like that. Here you've got this individual who, even though she's a materialist, she's buying into every single erroneous Christian assumption, namely that if this Bible is to be of any use whatsoever, then it must have been written by God himself. Anything less than that and it's useless. So she's a materialist, but she's unconsciously assumed these erroneous Christian assumptions about what the Bible is. First of all, even in Orthodox Christianity, and by Orthodox I don't mean the Orthodox Church, I mean in mainstream Christianity, that is not the view of the Bible. And in my book I explain in chapter 6, which is the longest chapter because it's about the Bible and about scripture, I explain that there's a difference between inspiration and channeling. I don't call it channeling. But the Bible is held to be inspired. It's not held to be channeled. Those are two very, very different things. And the scriptures of the Bible are held to be inspired in that they were written by human beings who were under the inspiration of God. But that means they were still writing according to their human limitations. So the Apostle Paul, for example, he didn't mention cars that would come about in the future because he was writing, inspired or not, he was writing as a human being living in the 1st century. That's inspiration, and that is whether you're talking about the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, or the Orthodox Church, that is the view of the Bible. That is the proper view of the Bible. Whether Christians know it or not, that is the held Orthodox view of the Bible. That's different from the Quran, which is what we would call channeled material. Because in the case of the Quran, for example, the Prophet Muhammad was praying, and the angel Gabriel comes down to him, and the angel Gabriel uses the Prophet Muhammad as a conduit to write the Quran. So in that sense, the Prophet Muhammad is being used as a puppet by the angel Gabriel. So unlike with the scriptures of the Bible, the Quran, according to Islam itself, was actually written by a divine source that does not have human limitations. And that's why it's so important to Muslims that the Quran, every word of the Quran, be seen as perfect, because it was held to be authored essentially by a divine being through Muhammad, unlike the scriptures of the Bible, which were authored by human beings allegedly inspired. Two very different things there. But most Christians think that their church believes, and maybe there are some churches out there that do believe, that the scriptures of the Bible were written by a divine being, but for the most part, no. The scriptures of the Bible were held to be written by inspired men, which is not the same thing as channeled material. But a lot of Christians don't know that. So when you call the Bible the Word of God, which it isn't, because in the Bible, Yeshua is the only Word of God, it evokes certain ideas, the idea that God himself wrote the Bible. And so because so many Christians believe that, the materialists who oppose the Christians, they borrow their assumptions, and when you encounter them in a debate, they assume that because you're on the side of the Bible, one, that you're a Christian, and two, you believe that God literally authored the Bible. And that's why I ask the question, where do you even begin? Is there even any point in me starting to explain even a tenth of what I've just explained regarding the difference between inspiration and channeled material, and the fact that Christians misunderstand what even their own churches hold to be true about the Bible? Is there even any point in me beginning to explain those things? And the answer is quite simply no, because materialists like the ones I was engaging with, they're not really interested in the truth. They've already come to their conclusions, and no matter what you say to them, no matter how well reasoned it is, they just don't care. They've arrived at their position and that's it. If they cared about the truth, then they would have engaged with what I said originally, because again, I laid out a very clear case about why this atheist was erroneous in thinking that Yeshua's prophecies had not come true. But they didn't respond to anything I said. They just threw Latin terms and other cliches at me. And so this is why I stopped getting in the habit of having theological debates, not just with materialists, but with Christians and anyone else, because it's just not worth your time. Ultimately, from a spiritual perspective, every soul is where they are in their development, and if they're willing and ready to hear what you have to say, then they're ready and willing to hear what you have to say, and that's the time to share it with them. That's why I like doing these live streams. It's why I like having written this book, is that this stuff is here for those who want it. But I don't feel any need whatsoever to go out and evangelize to souls, most of whom are not interested in hearing it and who are not in a position where they can use whatever information I have to share with them. So I've been very happy with this episode today, but I think I'll end it there. So thank you very much for watching, everyone, and may your moment be